The Labadists were a fairly small and fairly obscure religious group, and some of their members wound up finding a home at a place called Bohemia Manor. And so, before we explain the Labadists, let me start the story here with Bohemia Manor. And this involves Augustine Hermann. I'm sure I'm mangling his pronunciation. Augustine here was a German-born merchant, and he worked for the Dutch, who, remember, were up the coast in New Amsterdam, present-day New York, and then, remember, the Dutch had taken over New Sweden and pressed all the way down to the edge of the Chesapeake. Hermann was a really successful merchant and also an exceptional 17th century cartographer, a map maker. And Hermann liked Lord Baltimore's idea of manors, where, he gives these huge land grants to people for favors or for bringing enough workers with them. We'll talk more about how some of this worked in part 2. But Hermann, who was fairly wealthy already, offered to map the province of Maryland for Lord Baltimore with the most detailed, precise map created yet. And Lord Baltimore was into it. Remember, this is right after he's back in power, and he's back in power in, the 1660, 61, and he's got his son as governor. And so, essentially, what they're doing is flipping Hermann from working for the Dutch to coming in with Maryland. And so they give Hermann 20,000 acres up in the northeast corner of the Maryland land grant. The northeast corner, the part that is closest to the Dutch. It is in present day Cecil County, so map quiz stuff up there in the corner. But there's no Cecil County yet. It's just out there in the fringes of Maryland. Hermann was naturalized in 1663 and became a lord with a manor and all the powers that accrued to the lord of a manor in colonial Maryland. Now, the Labadists, here's the map. This is the map that Hermann created, and I know it might not look like much, but if you zoom in, the map is actually gigantic. It's all these different panels, and so all these little writings are incredibly precise of all the different people who own the parcels of land. It was incredible. And so he finishes it after a decade, 1673. Now, this is connected. You'll see in a few moments. So, over in France, in the 1500s, this movement developed around a Catholic critic, Jean de Labadie, and his followers, who grew after his death in number, were known as the Labadists. And two of these Labadists were Jasper Dankaerts, whose name you see over here, and Peter Sluyter. they were Dutch, and they came into what was by this time English North America. The Dutch had been kicked out. We'll talk more about that. But so they come into English America, and they're trying to convert people to their small, somewhat odd Christian religious sect that argued for extreme asceticism, like self-sacrifice and cutting off from the material world. It had a strong kind of like monkish quality, where, you're kind of a hermit, isolate yourself. And so Dankhartz eventually went his separate way, but Peter Sluyter, who was one of these Labadists who came to America, he wound up converting Ephraim Hermann. That was Augustine's son. Right? So here's where the two come together. So Augustine's son, Ephraim, is converted by Peter Sluyter, and it's unclear to what extent Ephraim did the persuading or Peter did the persuading, but they persuaded Papa, Augustine Hermann, to give them a big portion of Bohemia Manor, the Labadie tract. And a group of these Labadists settled there in 1684. They practiced extreme asceticism. I mean, like, Peter Sluyter developed this rule that fires weren't good for you because fires made you comfortable, and being comfortable brought you further away from God. They could use fires to cook, according to Sluyter, but not fires to warm themselves. They practiced celibacy. Men and women both lived there, but lived separately. And they ate this kind of a gruel that was, worse food than they had to eat, but they ate it because good food and the pleasure that it brought you took you further away from God. And so on. They are, in a way, their tolerance, the tolerance for them, the acceptance would be too strong, but tolerance is the right word, is an indication of what a remarkable place colonial Maryland was. People like this are persecuted all around the colonies, all around Europe, but here they find their little part of the land, and people talk about them, and they're what most think of as their odd, communistic, isolationist life, and they just get to live it. There's no source written by Peter Sluyter that describes the end of the community. The descriptions of the end of the community are written by people who, in my view, pretty clearly didn't like Peter Sluyter. And so the way the end of the community comes off in these stories is that Sluyter became a hypocrite, a con man, a religious racketeer, that he was breaking his own rules. He was living in a bigger house than everybody else, warming himself by the fire, enjoying tobacco when he told everybody else they couldn't smoke tobacco, and so on. And eventually, people came to see him as a hypocrite and a con man, and the community dissolved. Again, I don't know that all of that is factual, but it probably has some fact in it. Like I said, the sources here are people who have reason to be discrediting Peter Sloiter because they didn't like him. They thought they were weird. So, in part 2, we'll talk about some of these things that I've referred to several times, like the population in Maryland, the labor system, all that excitement. Oh my gosh, I can barely wait.